every one of us that have been in recovery or are in recovery or in the healing process, many times we may be there because we have followed the wrong crowd. So we follow these people, and many times it becomes a crowd, but then many times it could be individually as well. And we catch ourselves in these relationships quite often. They had stretched it to the point that now they had veered away from what the real truth was. And yet they were the ones teaching. So it's very serious when we begin to think about that, because we all have been misled from time to time in whatever capacity it is. Hey everybody, glad that we're all here. Is everybody glad you're here tonight? Yeah. I'm glad we're here tonight. So anyway, tonight we're going to talk about something that I would just almost wager that we've all come in contact with at one time or another. How many people would say that at some time or another you have followed the wrong crowd? Followed the wrong crowd. We all have, everybody in here probably is at some point, maybe even right now as we go through here, we're going to try to just dissect this a little bit, and we're going to look at some different things and kind of see what Jesus said about it and a few other things in some of the letters in the New Testament. But somewhere along the way, I mean, every one of us that have been in recovery or are in recovery or in the healing process, many times we may be there because we have followed the wrong crowd. And whose fault is it that we followed the wrong crowd? It's our fault that we followed the wrong crowd, but there may be many reasons that led to us following the wrong crowd. And see, even as a parent, and you know, we all have parents, and most parents, you know, they get so concerned that, oh man, you're hanging out with such and such, and you got hung up with the wrong crowd, and then A happened and B happened, and before you know it, we end up all the way at Z. And a lot of times with the people I encounter and counseling people, that's typically one of the things that's always said is they ended up following the wrong crowd. And so it sort of implies that maybe it's someone else's fault. But see, we have to take personal responsibility that somehow we ended up in that crowd for a reason. And so the other thing that I would challenge us to think about, as you see on the screen there, is that with every crowd, we don't just follow a crowd. There's typically somebody leading that crowd, right? I mean, there's somebody along the way that is leading that crowd. And I mean, if we looked at history before we even dig into what Jesus said, I mean, we could find all kind of people. Adolf Hitler, I mean, look what happened with the regime he had and people that followed him as a leader, and look what happened. I got a couple things I'll just read to you here, some research that's on your handout there, but millions of people were killed as a result of following Hitler. And I mean, we could talk for hours just how one person with his own ideas, you know, and he began to gather a following of people. And as a result of this one leader and his crowd that followed him, there were millions of people that died. And then there was the Jonestown Massacre. I mean, we know Jim Jones and the story of the Kool-Aid. They drank the Kool-Aid, and just an article I read here, it said, it was the most deadly single non-natural disaster in U.S. history until September 11th. 2001. On that day, November 18th, 1978, 912 people died from drinking the poison, 276 of whom were children. Jones died from a single gunshot wound to the head, but it is unclear whether or not he did this himself. Only a handful or so people survived, either by escaping into the jungle or hiding somewhere in the compound. In total, 918 people died either at the airport or at the Jonestown compound. And so see, you know, what tragedy happened by these people that got hung up in this crowd. And see, we know now, hindsight 2020, that was a cult that people got caught up in. And see, one of the things that I think we need to remember, and I was reading this book one time, and it talked about the dynamics of cults and how one of the things that's so appealing to people who join cults is that they are so family atmospheric, if you would. Because they make you feel like that you are part of something, and they want to meet every need. And they just strive to make sure that you live in a community where every need is getting met, and that all of those basic things that we talked about several weeks ago in one of those teachings, you know, love and respect and purpose and all those different things are met. And so if you listen to that on your surface, you think, well, that's what the Christian community is supposed to be, right? I mean, that's what we're supposed to be. But see, that's the whole dynamic that people get caught up into in cults when society breaks down in its variety of forms. And so see, it doesn't just happen in cults and in countries and all these other things, but we know it also happens in our churches. And it happens in religion and Christianity and all other religions around the world. I've got the article in here on Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. I mean, most of us have probably heard about them, but in 1974, it says here that the Bakers, we know, they founded the Praise the Lord Network. They were based in North Carolina. They achieved wide popularity as hosts of the syndicated Jim and Tammy Show. At its peak in the 80s, the PTL show reached as many as 13 million households. 13 million people were following them. See, that's a huge crowd, but they were following two specific leaders here, always to the drumbeat of appeals for donations. In 1989, Mr. Baker was convicted of federal charges that he had bilked followers out of $158 million by offering lifetime vacations at Heritage USA while knowing that he could not provide them and that he had diverted about $3.7 million to support an opulent lifestyle. And so see, it hits close to home that we see it happen in churches. We see it happen all across the news. We see it happen in companies. You get behind the wrong leader and then you see the CEO get discharged, but everybody is following this one person. I mean, we follow, great speakers, Billy Graham, Andy Stanley, Charles Stanley. We can get behind somebody just in a relationship, a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and before you know it, we realize that perhaps this didn't turn out exactly the way I thought that it should turn out. And so see, a leader is always, we're always listening to somebody who is a leader whether we realize it or not. And so we follow these people, and many times it becomes a crowd, but then many times it could be individually as well. And we catch ourselves in these relationships quite often. That's why we see also, I think the divorce rate is so high anymore, is everything was not what we thought it was going to be on the surface, and then we just part paths. And so then, this is nothing new that just happened all of a sudden and this time. This has been going on for years and years and years. And so if we drill in a little bit and we begin to look at what Jesus said when he was on earth, and he began to talk to the Pharisees. And so I want to look at this passage where he was engaging with them. It's in Matthew chapter 15. And they began to ask him, they had all their laws and they had all their traditions and they had the commandments, but then they would add all these other things so that they didn't break the commandments to make sure that they could do this so that didn't happen, and then they were really in trouble with God. And so then they began to question Jesus when they saw that he and his disciples were not exactly going around doing all their laws. And so hang on and you'll see where this goes. And it said, he answered to them and he said, why do you yourselves transgress the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? And so see, he brings that word tradition in there. And so we could park right there and think about that. And many times, I know when I began to church shop that almost every different place that you go to look at church, to worship God, you'll see different traditions. And it's just how they do it. And we hear the stories all the time that that's just the way we've always done it, right? And whether it's right, whether it's wrong, whether it's biblical, whether it's not biblical, or whatever group or circle you're in, we see those all the time, and we do things so many times that it just becomes a tradition. There's a certain amount of tradition that we could say just about CF. We come, we eat, we sing songs, we teach, we share a testimony, we go to groups, we form our circles, we talk, and then we leave and we go home, right? And it's a structure, but if we were not careful, it could become a tradition. Once in a while, you'll see that we shake things up a bit, and a few weeks ago, we didn't have a clue what we were really doing. And we kind of talked for a little while, and then people shared, and it was a fabulous service. And it worked out great, but there was no plan. And there was no tradition at all in that service. And it was just, felt God-filled, and people just really shared and encouraged each other. So these Pharisees had these things that called traditions, and they were challenging Jesus and his disciples, and it says, for God said, honor your father and mother, and he who speaks evil of the father and mother is to be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever I have that would help you has been given to God. he is not to honor his father or his mother. And here's the kicker. And by this, Jesus said, you have invalidated the word of God for the sake of your tradition. So see, the important part of this is they were the ones that was to be teaching the people. In other words, they were the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, and they were to have all this figured out, but they had strayed so far that they had stretched it to the point that now they had veered away from what the real truth was. And yet they were the ones teaching. And so on into this discussion, the disciples began to ask Jesus, they were like, don't you realize when you said it to them, you may have offended them? And so he says to his disciples, he said, let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind, and if a blind man guides a blind man, both will fall into a pit. Now see, this tells us a lot right here, because a blind man leading a blind man. Now, I'll start with the blind men that are being led. Think about that. I mean, we have kind of been there. I mean, they're blind because you could put us in that category. We need to know. What can I do? What can help me get better? What can help me get past my past? What can help me get past my addiction? What can help me restore my marriage? What can help me get through this depression? I'm blind to that. I have no idea what to do. And so we go to people we know, we go to our Bibles, we go to our books, we go to the self-help sections, we go to church, we go to recovery groups, we go to all these things because we really are blind to what we need to do. But what Jesus is saying is, look, you've got people that don't know what to do, and they're going to people that they don't realize are blind to be able to tell them. Because if they continue to follow them, he said that you both will fall into a pit. It's sort of like the slide we had. You follow, you fall off of the pit, fall off of the cliff, fall into a pit. And so it's very serious when we begin to think about that, because we all have been misled from time to time in whatever capacity it is. He went on to say to them at one of these conversations he engaged in, and he said, woe to you, teachers of the law and the Pharisees. See, teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they were the teachers, teaching the people, and yet they were blind and leading them in a wrong direction. He said, you hypocrites, you travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. Ouch. Ouch. You are supposed to be teaching these people the right way to go. You go out of your way to get them, and you're taking them in the wrong direction. You are misguiding them. You're not giving them eyes to see what they need to see. Right in the church system, it would be like you're coming to CF hoping you're going to get what you need. I'm giving you wrong information and you're believing it. And you're going out and your life is not improving at all. I mean, if you can imagine, they started with the Ten Commandments and they built on that with all these other laws. And it came to this point that it's, how can you do it? You just can't do it. You can never wear all the right clothes. You can never say all the right things. You can never do everything exactly the way you're supposed to do it. Will we never be good enough? And it had to be how they felt, because it's what they were being taught. And so Jesus was saying, you keep taking this route and you're going to fall off of a pit. And see, if we went around the room, we could probably all come up with stories, and I tried this and I tried that and I tried that, couldn't we? And that didn't work, and that took me deeper into my depression, and that hurt me, and this didn't help me, and we tried all these different things. And see, that doesn't necessarily mean that all those things was wrong, because a lot of it may have to do with were we really receiving what may have been the truth, but in a lot of cases it may have just been some false idea. It's kind of like, get rich quick schemes and, do this and you'll be there. And you seldom hear the success stories. And it's the same way in life, because we all want to be led. We're all blind to something that we want somebody to show us the way. And yet if we're following people who are blind themselves, we're getting nowhere. We're walking around in circles. We're walking around in the dark. I'm convinced that this is why a lot of people abandon the church. You think about it. Look at how many people were probably caught up in that tragic thing with Jim and Tammy Baker. You can look at when there's a scandal in a church and the pastor is caught up in something, or a lead pastor or associate pastor, and then there's a sex scandal or there's an embezzlement charge, and then all these other things come to life, and then the church ends up splitting, right? And in many cases, it just totally falls apart because people are following people. That's what we do. People follow people. You know, many years ago, the church that we're in went through a split. And I can remember people saying, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Are you going there? Are you staying here? Or what are you going to do? And people were looking to me, and I didn't have any great wisdom. You know, I'm still growing in wisdom. I'm still not spiritually mature and may never be, but people looked at me, you know, as a leader of Celebrating Freedom, and they're like, what are you going to do? As if you have to pick sides. And fortunately, it had to be through God's wisdom. I just said, God hasn't told me to do anything but stay right where I'm at. I'm following God. But see, a lot of people are following a person. Now, we can gain a lot from what people can teach us and what they've written in books, but we have to have, as we're going to see in a minute, a grid or a foundation that we're putting all these things through to try to realize what truth is. Because if we don't, we follow a person, we put all of our hope into what they're saying is true. I remember, you know, I'm not an educated person, and especially when it comes to Bible things, I'm not educated. And I remember a pastor saying, well, why aren't you a Bible scholar? You could be. You just dig in and you find out, and God will teach you these things. And I remember saying, I can dig in, and perhaps God can teach me some things. And I remember a transition in my life that I probably didn't even know was happening at the time, but as I began to study and read and do all these different things, and I would hear people teach on TV or on a weekend or on the radio or whatever, and I began to what I would call own what I believe. And I would hear somebody say something, and I would even say to myself, I don't agree with that. I'm not exactly sure that that's what that letter is trying to say that Paul wrote, or I'm not sure that's what Jesus said. Now, that didn't mean I was right either, but I had something going on inside of me that I knew because I was pursuing things myself through a grid of truth that I had established from looking to God to teach me. And I could discern if something I thought somebody else said didn't line up with that grid. And it gave me great encouragement because I dealt for years with low self-worth, low self-esteem, and just felt like a real dummy. And I began to realize that I can own what I believe and say, I don't agree with that. I don't think that lines up with what the teachings of Jesus was. Or I don't think that's what Paul really meant when he said that. And I think that's where God wants to get us to if we're followers of Jesus. See, this is a universal principle. You don't just have to be a Jesus follower to follow the wrong crowd. I mean, everybody does it. It's universal. But everybody also has to have a grid system that they're trying to figure out. This is, okay, all that is being said, but at least this is my starting point for me to run everything that I hear, see, touch, and feel through this grid of what I'm saying is my foundation for truth. So according to Jesus, blind following the blind, not knowing where we're going, they will fall in a pit. Now, people follow people, as we said, and I put this passage in here in James because this became a really interesting thing to me. And James, he took on this idea, and we've heard teaching on the tongue all the time, but this just really supports it, and a little something I wanted to throw in here just because we've heard this passage before of how we should watch our tongue, right? And I mean, we call on it all the time, and we know that it applies to everybody. But I want you to look at how James really put this into context. I mean, he starts out, he's talking to teachers. He's talking, it applies to everybody, but he is talking to teachers, which proves the principle that we just discussed here. He said, not many of you should become teachers in the church. Why? See, he's talking to people, and he's saying, not many of you should become teachers, and here's why. Because they will be judged more strictly, because indeed we all make many mistakes. For if we could control our tongues, we would be perfect and could control ourselves in every way. And so then he goes on to give those examples about a horse with a bridle, and you can control a huge horse with just a bridle. And then he talks about the rudder on a ship and this huge ship, and one little rudder is steering it. And when I saw that part about, the ship's rudder, and you think about it. Now you think about, just pick your own person. One person, let's say Jim Baker, he was a rudder, but he was controlling a large group of people. And so see, he was saying, not many of you should be teachers because look, what you say, people are going to listen to you and they're going to follow you. And there are going to be a percentage of these people who are not going to seek out truth on their own. And they're going to be ignorant to the truth. And you're going to be judged more strictly because you better tell the truth if you're talking about the things of God. And so see, I'm teaching. It's scary to me when I come up and speak to you folks because I want God to teach something that He has taught me that is true. And if you go check it through the grid system of what I'm teaching of Jesus, you would say, yeah, he got that right. And if you ever find that not to be true, then you have permission and please should come and say, I think you missed that. And you owe this audience an apology. But see, you have to understand, I'm teaching you through the grid of what this ministry is about. Jesus-centered. Christ is at the center. I'm looking to the way Jesus walked and talked is my grid for everything. His whole idea of loving each other, and how he accepted everybody no matter what. And so it's interesting that James brings that out and said, look, you need to be careful there because people are going to follow you. And people do follow people, don't they? I mean, I think it's sad that you hear often, and I've done it before. I don't think I do it anymore, but many times even churches or ministries are not identified by their ministry. They're identified by what? A person. Do you go to such and such? Yes, such and such is the pastor and he is awesome. Right? I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but where is the focus? And if that person is teaching everything that lines up with what your foundation is, then you and I will be not following the wrong crowd and not putting our hope and our trust in, well, such and such said. I mean, many, many years I was just downright lazy. I wouldn't do the research. I would just say somebody said it, and therefore I kind of believed it. I mean, they'd throw a scripture in there, right? I mean, we can do that. I mean, we do it all the time. We grab a scripture, we throw it out there, and people take it hook, line, and sinker. Well, there you have it. It's Galatians whatever, so there it is. And many times we don't take and look at context to try to say, what is it really saying? What is God really saying? Am I getting caught up in here? Because see, the reason this is so important is because if we truly want to be free, if we want to walk in the freedom, the joy, the peace that Jesus talked about, then, and we are followers of Jesus, then as we're going to see, He wants to be that source and that foundation for us. And so see, then there's the other option of, okay, I'm agnostic or I'm atheist or I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Jesus follower, so don't buy in all that. And so everything I've said, even though it's a universal principle, if you're not following Jesus, then many times we don't have anybody we're following and we're looking to our own self, right? And I've done that. Most of us who are in recovery or healing ministries, we've looked to our own self and it seldom has worked out that way. And we can become so intellectual and so smart that we have it all figured out, and yet inside we really don't have it all figured out, right? We can lean into our own understanding, and look at what the writer of Proverbs wrote. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. Then you'll have healing for your body and strength for your bones. Fools think their own way is right, but the wise listen to others. There's a path before each person that seems right, but its end is death. I mean, that verse right there is most of our verse as a recovery verse, isn't it? There was a path that looked right. It didn't end too well, right? It was there. And so, see, we can lean into our own self and not lean into any spiritual or outside group or anything. And we can just handle it all on ourselves. And we can even isolate ourselves from crowds. But we can still not be headed in the right direction. So who or what are we following? And see, Jesus, he kind of wrapped it up early on. I mean, he laid the groundwork with, I love this one. And he look at the emphasis he puts there on Matthew 7. He says, anyone who listens and follows, two parts. And I was just looking at that today, and I picked up on that. But anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise. There's two parts. Because a lot of times we listen a lot, don't we? We listen to counselors. We listen to our spouse. And we listen to a lot of things. But then we have to decide, what are we following? Are we going to follow what we listen to? Are we going to not do anything? We're going to stay in ourselves. So see, we follow people, we follow leaders, we follow crowds, trends, all these different things. And Jesus is saying, look, if you need a formula, here it is. Anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise. And then he goes on to give that example about a house being built on a rock. And it's going to stand no matter what happens, because that's your foundation. You have followed the right thing. You're following the wisdom that I am teaching you, which I am ensuring to you that it is right. And so then he says, here's the flip side. Anyone who hears and doesn't obey or doesn't follow, same principle, same choices. We listened. Now we have a choice. He is foolish. And he goes on to give the other example that we know so well about building the house on the sand. And then when the rain and the floods came, or the troubles and the turmoil in life, then he says, look, it will collapse with a mighty crash. It kind of lines up with the other thing he said, that, you're going to fall in a pit. If you're following that wrong crowd, the wrong teacher, the wrong leader, whatever, you're going to crash and burn. And so we have to begin to ask ourselves, how are we going to know? What do we do? How do we know we're doing the right thing? Well, see, if you're a Jesus follower, then he said you will know them by their fruits. And see, we connect with a lot of people, don't we? I mean, we connect with a lot of people in life. And so, it's kind of like when you first start dating or whatever, and you're they call it the honeymoon period or whatever, right? And you just, everything is so warm and fuzzy, and this is the greatest person that's ever been, and then you've been around them a while, and it's not so great, and then the longer you know them, you're like, I didn't know them at all, right? And that's not always the case, because we find people that stand the test of you know them by their fruit, and they're consistent with who you saw them to be at the beginning. But many times that's not the case, is it? And we find that with mentors, we find it in relationships, we find it in companies. I mean, it happens in our workplaces. We get a job, right? We think it's the greatest thing ever, and then a few days or weeks into it, it's like the curtain opens. And so, see, Jesus said this. He said, you'll know them by their fruits. You will know them by their fruits. And see, he spent a lot of time talking about that, that you can tell. And when I think of that, I think, what's fruit? Well, just go to Galatians and look at the fruit of the Spirit. It's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control, and all those things. And so many times I've made this mistake, and I have seen so many people, in the realm of healing and recovery, you hear the word mentor and sponsors and accountability partners and all this. And I'm always amazed that, many times people, they never look at the fruit whenever they're trying to pick somebody to get advice from. And see, a lot of that boils down, I believe, to what is our motive? Because maybe I want somebody that has a little bit of rotten fruit because I don't, you know what I'm saying? I'm not ready to have the whole good thing yet. So if I've got a little bit of rottenness in this person, using the fruit metaphor there, then I'm still good, right? But see, if we're serious about not heading toward falling in a pit, as Jesus said, then we can look at that example and we can really gauge that. And we can have all kind of circles of people in our life. But those people that we really look to for wisdom and guidance, first of all, it will line up with what our grid is of what Jesus taught. And then we can have others, in all different phases of life. Even Jesus, the time he walked on the earth, he had what looked like the inner circle, which, just John and Peter and a few of the guys. And then he had the outer circle, the 12 disciples, apostles, and then he had the multitudes, right? And so he didn't isolate. He was around all these different people, but you could see the way he practiced what he taught, because he would teach these multitudes of people, and sometimes it was very confusing, but he would come away to the disciples and he'd say, now look, let me just tell you what this means. Here's what it really means. And so see, he stepped down a notch and he said, let me give you a little bit more explanation of that. And so then he had the other ones, that he'd get to, and they probably had their other private and intimate conversations as well. But see, we'll know those people by their fruit. And see, we may be thinking about this right now. It's like, am I following the wrong crowd, the wrong leader? And, we just may be thinking, I got to do some cleaning house. I can't be around this person at this level anymore because it's taken me a direction that is not good. And we have to be brutally honest with ourselves, especially because we're here in an effort to be free in Jesus. And with what issues we have to decide, who are we following, and is that working for me? Even Jesus, look, John wrote in his letter, he said, many people didn't receive Jesus. He came into the world knew him, but a lot of people, they didn't buy in. They couldn't see him as the real deal. But then for those who did, they really found true life. And so some things to think about if you're a follower of Jesus, Freedom Points. He should be our sole source. We should be looking to him first of truth and directions in whatever variety of forms it is. And when I say variety of forms, it's like, okay, you're here tonight. So what you're hoping in this form is that you're hearing a message that Jesus would have taught. An idea that Jesus proclaimed is what you're hoping that you got from this form. And you're hoping that when you go to lunch with somebody you're hoping to get encouragement from, that you find that same thing. And then when you call your accountability partner, you go to your church on, whenever you go and hear teachings or Bible studies or whatever it is you do, you're hoping that you hear things that line up with Jesus being the true source, with it not being a watered down, Jesus, but, that but syndrome. It gets us, Jesus wants to teach us everything. And he had told the disciples before he left that, that he would remind them through, we've said this over and over, sending the Holy Spirit, and that he would teach them all things. And I remember when I read that passage, and as I said earlier, I've spent a lot of my life with feelings of low self-worth, and I'm not there anymore. And I know that I need to be taught. But when I read that verse and I realized, my education is, compared to a lot of other people, is just not there. Because 12th grade is as far as I got. And that's okay. But I remember reading this verse and I'm like, there it is. He will teach me. And I took that for what it meant. I literally took that God would teach me. And I have stood on that. And I am consistently, God, tell me this. Teach me this. Tell me what this means. I don't understand this. And he has been faithful to teach me. And it's been a wonderful experience. I would not trade it for anything. And he will do the same for all of us. He told them also that he would guide us in all truth. In other words, if I'm headed down this direction, he will give us that little, glitch that we're like, that may not be the right thing. But remember what he said? If you listen and follow. And so see, he will guide us in all truth, but we're still kind of the ones that has to take the steps, right? So if he's guiding us and he gives us that little go this direction, we have a choice to make. Who are we going to follow? What direction? Are we just going to stay in our own crowd? Or are we going to go a different direction? Or maybe that is the right direction. And it's going deeper into that direction that he's asking us to go. But he promised us that he would guide us in all truth. And so as we walk it out, share your experience. I mean, many of you in here can go into your group and you can encourage somebody my life was a disaster when I did this. I was deceived. I went down that road. It was not truth. It looked exactly like truth. I went off into the pit, off the cliff, big time. And let me tell you how God turned my life around. Go in your group, share that with your group, your friends, the people that you're accountable to, and encourage them. Go back to the basics. What's our foundation? What is our grid filter? What is it that we're weighing every decision in our life for? The things we're listening to are determining who we follow. I mean, what is that grid system? I mean, is it Jesus? Is it the Bible? Is it some other religion? Is it a person? Is it, I hope my wife or my husband has it figured out because I don't? Is it my mom, my dad, you see where I'm going? I mean, what is my grid system to measure everything that comes into my head? Paul talked about taking thoughts captive, which is the whole idea of like, I'm grabbing this thought and I'm going to really kind of dissect. Is this what goes through the idea? He went on to say, taking it captive to the obedience of Christ, which he was saying that was his grid system. In other words, when I get this thought, it immediately goes through this, well, that doesn't line up with the teachings of love, of Jesus, or forgiving, or all those other things. That was his grid system. And that's what he meant by that. I'm taking these thoughts captive to the obedience of Christ. That may not be where you're at. That's where I'm at. That's where I strive to be. I don't catch every thought. I'm not saying that. But I strive to live my life running it through the grid system of what Jesus taught. Strive this week to acknowledge that if you're a follower of Jesus, that he will direct our ways. I mean, he will. I'm confident that he will meet all of our needs in everything that we do. So I hope that we've all been challenged to think about, who are we following? What crowd are we following? Who is the leader of that crowd? Is it healthy? Is it unhealthy? And furthermore, not only what am I following, but what is my foundation? What is it really? And if it's not where you feel like it needs to be, then what am I going to do to change it? And if you don't know, ask one of those people that you can tell by their fruit that they probably at least have solid wisdom until I can learn this and get this on my own. Well, God, we're thankful that you are willing to lead us, and we're thankful that you give us plenty of examples that we can read about in the books and the letters that all the people wrote, and we're thankful for the examples that were written down in the life of Jesus. And Lord, we believe that you are willing to lead us and that you want to lead us. And Lord, help us to come to grips with what that looks like. It's not always hard. It's not always easy to understand that. And so, Lord, teach us in baby steps and help us to make those changes that you may want us to make, or to speak out and encourage those who need to be encouraged. And we thank you so much for life, and we thank you for loving us, and thank you for taking us all on in all of our forms with all of our issues and loving us all just equally the same. And thank you that you're able to manage us all at the same time. And we love you so much, and thank you in Jesus. Amen.